are about to experience the Life Science Effect, Solo Edition. Hi everybody, Steve Vinson. Once again, welcome to the Life Science Effect. Thanks for listening throughout the summer. I'll be doing these solo episodes. I'm on a recent kick of wondering what it takes to go from serving corporate America, big pharma, big medical device, big biotech, and get into the entrepreneurial sort of startup space. My interest was piqued, of course, through this podcast because I do talk, as you may have noticed, I talk to a lot of people in the startup space and as part of the show, and it's gotten me interested in wondering how can I use my skills as a project manager and a consultant in big pharma, big biotech, how can that be translatable into the smaller world of startups, maybe more fast-paced, certainly more exciting in some cases. You know, as I've been thinking about how I can serve that community, the entrepreneurial startup size community, I've been thinking how to make that transition from many years, decades in big pharma, big biotech, et cetera. How can I make that transition? And I happened to run across in an episode of a podcast I listened to, the James Altucher Show, which I highly recommend, by the way. The James Altucher podcast, it may be called. Anyway, so one of the recent episodes had Rich KARLGAARD, who wrote a book called Late Bloomers, The Power of Patience in a World Obsessed with Early Achievement. He's making the point of how you can bloom later in life. You don't have to necessarily, when you start out in your career, find your passion and find your calling early on. You can find a passion and a calling and then later transition to a different one. So he talks a lot in his book and in this podcast episode about something called adjacency. And what he means by that is if you could find some way to serve a different community or a different sized company or a different type of career by finding something adjacent. So one of the examples he uses is a journalist that he knew who wanted to write fiction. Well, she first started out writing long essays, which are more similar to journalistic articles. And that opened the door for her to be able to write longer fictional essays. And eventually she got to work on her novel. So in my case, or in maybe your case, if you're in big pharma looking to make or if maybe you're in academia and you want to get into, like we discussed somewhat last time, if you're in academia and you want to become a corporate person or you want to get into a startup, using this concept of adjacency is something that you will hear me talk about today on the show. As with last time, and as I often do, I read an article in the Life Science Leader, and so I thought I would just talk through that article a little bit. It's a little bit old. It's from 2010, but I think there's some timeless lessons in here as well. A few things maybe not timeless, but I'll point those out as we go. But there's a story here of three different entrepreneurs bio-entrepreneurs who actually made the transition from all three of them. It wasn't the point of the story, but all three of them came out of a different environment, more of a corporate, bigger environment, and then ended up being entrepreneurs. So on to the article. Again, there'll be a link to the article in the show notes. It's called What Does It Take to Succeed as a Bio-Entrepreneur from the Life Science Leader. It's an article by Karl Schmieder, and it's from September of 2010, but again, still relevant today. So it's three different guys. One is Stan Yakutin, who started at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals and now heads a global consulting company after making his way through several small startups. The global consulting company helps bioventures at all stages of their development. The second one is Craig Shamasaki, started at Genentech and wrote a book on the bio business called The Business of Bioscience, what goes into making a biotechnology product And now he too helps late stage companies through a consulting company called the Biosource Consulting Group. But again, he co-founded and exited several small bio startups. And then the third guy is Jim Chinitz, who spent 20 years in the industry, in the life science industry, and then, of course, founded a startup called Population Diagnostics. And they just completed their first round of funding as of 2010. So again, this is one of the things that's probably not timely because I did not do the research to see how population diagnostics is doing now. Maybe that'd be an interesting topic for the next show. We'll see. But so the article goes on to talk about why these guys decided to become bio-entrepreneurs. Mr. Yakutan says he didn't fit the corporate mold, which is, and he wasn't into playing politics. My first thought when I read that was, I'm not sure anybody in corporate America feels like they meet that they fit the corporate mold or is willing to play politics. If you were to ask them, because the quote unquote corporate mold has this sort of negative connotation, and everybody thinks playing politics, and I'm doing air quotes, is considered a bad thing because they think of the worst of people when they do that. What I would say is that's a fun thing to say. But I don't think anybody feels like they fit that description, the corporate mold and the playing politics. However, as is with Mr. Yakutan, I'm sure many of us have a feeling like there's something else out there for us that maybe being in a corporate situation doesn't quite do it for us. The other interesting thing is he said he knew nothing about raising money or evaluations, and he said it didn't matter. What mattered was his sense of independence. So I think what he's talking about there is what drives you inside. If there's something pulling you toward, so I wouldn't look at it as something pushing me out of the corporate world. If I'm him, I would think of it as he had a passion and a need for some independence that he couldn't find in the corporate world. And so he was pulled out. Craig Shimasaki says that what compelled him to become a bio-entrepreneur was that he didn't really know what an entrepreneur was, but he was creative and inventive and wanted to learn business. So while he was at Genentech, he became friends with a researcher who eventually did a startup and then recruited him. And he believes, a unique perspective because a lot of the startup biotech companies, I think this is probably still true today, are made up of a lot of professors and scientists, so a lot of academic background in bio startups these days. He got an executive MBA, and so he was able to bring that sense of business to it. And I can relate somewhat. I'm not a scientist, I'm an engineer, but I haven't really practiced engineering in a long time. But I do have a sense of how to get things done, and execution is one of my strong points in communication and building teams and relationships. But I don't have the scientific and professorial, the academic background. So I can kind of relate to what he's saying a little bit here. Jim Chinitz made his way up in sales and marketing and business development. And then he noticed that with the academic and technological folks in startups were having trouble translating discoveries into the clinic and getting them to patients. And so he felt like there was a better way using, and so he started Population Diagnostics based on getting discoveries through the Human Genome Project, getting those translated into treatments faster. So then the guys, the three folks talk about how they chose the particular area, and I did notice some common themes. One is that they talk about meeting unmet medical needs, and I really like that one because when you're looking at new ideas for business, if you or especially in the life sciences, obviously, all of us are driven to some extent by helping patients, and when there's an unmet need in the marketplace, that does two things. One is it makes it easier to get money from investors, and the other is we are actually helping people, which is why a lot of us got into this business in the first place. The next question the article sort of poses is, what are the challenges? And I love this because one of the things I try to do when I'm doing my interviews, which will start again late summer, early fall, don't worry. But one of the things I try to do is get some lessons learned out of the folks I interview. And that's where some of our very rich conversation comes in. I'm not trying to catch them in a mistake or get them to air their dirty laundry. It's just that I think we can all learn from each other if we talk about what challenges we've had and what obstacles we've overcome. And I love what Mr. Yakutan says when he says the easiest way to fail is to stick to a rigid plan. One of my favorite quotes about project management is, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And I recently heard a corollary to this in a book I'm reading, and he says, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And oh yeah, the enemy has a plan too. And so planning is beneficial in my view in that it serves as evidence that planning took place. I stole that from a book called Good to Great by James Collins, by the way, but I love it. And what I think the entrepreneur here is getting at is have a plan. You have your technology, you know your market, you have capital, you have talent and management. You maybe even have obstacles such as regulatory approval, but what you have to realize is you're going to uncover things you never thought of when you were doing your planning. So you have to be flexible enough to be able to zig when somebody else zags at you. And I think that's what he's saying. Don't stick to your rigid plan in the face of clear evidence that the plan isn't working. Be ready to adjust. Mr. Shimasaki, he talks about how just because you started the company doesn't mean, and you may be the perfect person to start the company. One of the things he had to learn was just that you may not be the right person to take it from startup to growth. So keep that in mind. And he talks something near and dear to my heart. He talks about working with the FDA. And I love some of the things he says, which is FDA are just people, and what their charter is in life is to get life-saving medicines to market without those life-saving medicines being overly risky to people's health. So it's like get good medicine to people, but we tend to think of the FDA's duty seems to be, at least some people in the industry think their job is to keep medicines from getting to market. The truth is they want to keep bad medicine from getting to market, medicine that will harm patients. But their real job is to get these medical breakthroughs to the market. And I think Mr. Shimasaki makes the point that they're just people, and if you can help them understand your technology and find ways to reduce risk and help the FDA understand that ultimately you are responsible for the risk of your product. And that, yes, you want it to help patients. And yes, I mean, we all want to get rich doing it, right? But at the same time, you own the risk. The FDA doesn't own the risk. And he says if more companies understood that, it's not the FDA's job to keep you from harming people. I mean, they kind of have that police power to do that. But you own that risk. It's your job. And their job is to make sure you own that responsibility to keep your product from hurting people. So that's my opinion. That's not necessarily what he's saying here in this article. But I'll repeat that. It's not the FDA's job to keep you from releasing a medication that will harm patients. It's not the FDA's job to make sure that your medication will do what you say it does. Sounds counterintuitive. It's your job to do those things. And it's their job to make sure you're doing your job. Then Mr. Chenitz talks about some of his challenges were communicating the story of your medication or your drug or whatever it is you're trying to get to the market, just so that people get it. I mean, you have lived it and breathed it for years, your product, potentially for years. That doesn't mean that the investors are just going to automatically get it. So he said one of his challenges was being able to tell that story. And then they talk about some of the mistakes they've seen people make. One of the interesting, what could be controversial, is what Mr. Yakutan says, that one of the mistakes he sees is people believing that technology is important. I don't know. I kind of think it is. But he says, but it's interesting. He says it's cliche, but he said you can have the best technology and the worst management team, and the company will fail. But he believes you can have the worst technology and the best management team, and the company will succeed. So his assertion is that management is more important than technology. I mean, as a project manager myself, and where my skill set is in management and relationships, communication, things like that. I mean, I'm delighted to believe that you can make that work. However, I think what we're all going for is probably good technology and a good management team. But hey, I'd be interested in hearing other thoughts on that. Mistake that Mr. Shimasaki talks about is not knowing what you don't know and not recognizing that there are unknown unknowns. This kind of goes back to the sticking to a rigid plan concept. When you're planning, you have to realize that yes, you can plan for risks, but there are things you don't know. Who was it? Dick Cheney or Don Rumsfeld or somebody back in the early 2000s said there are known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns. It's the unknown unknowns that'll get you. So he says the solution is pay careful attention, be an adaptive learner, and realize you can't know everything. Humility, understanding your weaknesses, hiring people that complement your weaknesses with their strengths, etc. None of us is in this alone, is a point he wants to make. You succeed based on how you're able to enroll others in your vision. And then Chenitz talks about how people need to be honest with themselves about what they really want. For example, do you want to be a small part of a big company, or do you want to be a big part of a small company? And that's important when you're deciding what it is you're actually trying to grow here. He talks about understanding other people's agenda. He sees entrepreneurs making the mistake of they know they have their agenda and they just automatically think the investors or the talent or whoever is just automatically going to buy into their vision, when really you should be looking at what the other person wants, what's their agenda, what are they hoping to get out of an investment or out of joining your team or whatever, and tailoring your approach to that and making sure you have a fit. Because really, when you go to raise capital, whether you're raising capital or trying to build a team or whatever it is, you may be interviewing or you may be trying to convince somebody that your idea is fantastic, but that's only half of what you're doing. The other half is helping the other person understand your vision and what you're trying to do to see if there's fit. Because if there's not fit, you could do the best sales job in the world and get the money or get the talent on board, get the team built, and then find out, oh, they feel like they were sold a bill of goods because your vision, once they really understood it, doesn't really match what they're trying to do in their life and their career. And then finally, I'm gonna skip over a section here. You can go read the article. They ask a question about what does it take to be successful. I'm gonna skip over that, let you go do that research on your own. But here's a really interesting one that I think I want to do more research, and maybe this will be another show. And the question that they asked is, back in 2010, remember, what are some of the pros and cons of starting a life sciences company in a non-biotechnology hub? This was very interesting to me because if you're a listener in Boston or in the Bay Area, in California, San Diego maybe you're thinking, well, what do I care what the pros and cons are starting in a hub is? Of course you start your company in a hub. However, those of us that maybe are in the Silicon Prairie, in flyover country, or even if you're in Boston or on one of the coasts, you might want to pay attention to the idea that there are pros, of course, obvious pros to doing it where you are, but there are some disadvantages where the non-hub areas, maybe the burgeoning hubs, the places that want to become hubs, maybe have some significant advantages. So I was interested to read what these guys thought back in almost 10 years ago now. I'll do more research and we'll do another show on this. Maybe when I start having guests again, maybe we'll get some of the folks from 16 Tech, or maybe get somebody from one of the hubs, Boston or California, to come and weigh in. But here's what these guys had to say. The obvious things that they had to say are the availability to network. Say you're in Boston and you have a medical device company, or you have a biotech company and you're in the Bay Area. Obviously, when you go to those biotech-focused meetings, everybody's there, right? That's where people go to meet other people. Also, the access to local venture capital, academic institutions, research universities, etc., the workforce, the lab space, the leaders, all very clear advantages. On the other hand, those advantages, sometimes your biggest strength can become your biggest weakness, which is those meetings are always crowded. There are people there. When you go to one of these things to get heard, you're going to struggle because there are so many people there. So you might, in the non-traditional hubs, say you're in Indianapolis or Atlanta or someplace, elsewhere in the country, or in, say, Scotland or Canada, somewhere around the world that's not considered a hub, you may get more local attention from, say, local media. You might have access to angel investors that you may never get at a hub. And there's the hunger factor. There's money from government institutions and from nonprofits and the local universities. We have some tremendous universities here in central Indiana, as they do in other places around the country and around the world, who would like nothing more than to help keep some of the fantastic scientists from leaving and going to the coast. They'd love to keep them here. So they're willing to do a lot of things to help a startup succeed that maybe on one of the coasts, you might not get that kind of really specialized attention. So I'm really interested in that topic. And so I think I've just given myself a homework assignment. That having been said, that's that article, and that's what I think of it. Feel free to shoot me an email, steven.vinson@bpm-associates.com. Tell me what you think. If you have a chance to read the article, like I said, there'll be a link in the show notes. In the meantime, we'll start having guests again here in a month or so, and I will still periodically do these solo conversations, but let's make it two-way. Hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter and let me know what you think. In the meantime, thank you. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. You have just experienced the Life Science Effect. If you liked it, be sure and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And more importantly, tell your colleagues, tell your boss, tell your friends. It'll make you look smart, and maybe it'll even get you a raise. Thanks again to our presenting sponsor, BPM Associates. Set your medical innovations in motion. BPM helps life science companies design, manage, and execute their most complex projects. What effect will you cause? Thanks to today's guest and to all of our guests. Who else should I be talking to? Send me an email at steven.vinson@bpm-associates.com. That's all for now. Thanks for listening, and go make something amazing happen.